The virtual rainbow brings together LGBTQ+ youth and their families, community leaders, professionals, and healthcare providers to learn and celebrate diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome.
This is S.J. Howell. I go by my last name Howell. And I am excited to join you all to chat about LGBTQ law and policy. I'll just say up front, there is a remarkably broad range of laws and policies, both at the state and local level and federally, that touch the lives of queer and trans folks. In 50 minutes, we couldn't possibly cover them all. I'm going to do a pretty brief, or not brief, but a high-level overview, and then I'm really happy to take questions and dive in to more depth into things that folks may have specific interest in. So do feel free to use that Q&A or chat function, and I'll keep my eye on it and try to be a little more responsive as we go through this. Generally speaking, here's what I'm going to move through, and I'll just say up front, my PowerPoint is super boring. I apologize, I'm terrible at PowerPoint, but I wanted to give folks at least a visual reference to what we're talking about. So I'm going to spend some time just doing a sort of snapshot of where we are now, where current law and policy is mostly focused at the state level. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about both past challenges and attacks and potential things we see that might come up, and then similarly potential opportunities for law and policy change, what we're working on. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion if folks have any. So Montana in 2020, where we're at now. So I will say that, there are a lot of things in Montana law and policy that that state law is actually silent on. So there are lots of issues that other states have addressed legally, either positively or negatively, that Montana actually hasn't addressed. For us right now, some of that silence is not a bad thing. I'll say overall, the Montana State Legislature, the body that creates and passes new policy, is not particularly friendly to LGBTQ folks or to sort of proactive, affirming policy. However, the courts, including the state Supreme Court and our state constitution, are fairly friendly and affirming to LGBTQ rights. So although it can seem frustrating and concerning that there are chunks of policy where we don't have clearly defined law or policy, in day-to-day life, that's often not a bad thing. I do want to talk through a handful of areas where we do have some specific law on the books. Healthcare is one. Healthcare is an area where we are fairly mixed in Montana. We do not have state-level specific protection from discrimination for LGBTQ folks in matters of healthcare. So that's health insurance coverage, access to care, protection from discrimination by providers, etc. We are fairly well covered by federal law in this case, though. The ACA, when the ACA was passed, there was a provision, it's commonly known as Section 1557, which provides for protection from discrimination for LGBTQ folks in both access to health insurance and access to health care and procedures. And that applies to any public health program, so Medicaid, Medicare, et cetera, as well as private health insurance that accepts federal dollars in any way. And we're lucky in Montana because we don't have a lot of health insurance plans out there, and almost all of our private health insurers accept federal dollars through the ACA marketplace. So currently, right now, all private health insurers are required to provide plans that do not discriminate against, in particular here, transgender and non-binary individuals, and are required to cover transition-related care. That's a new thing as of the last 5 years or so, and it's pretty important. We'll talk in the second half of this about some looming threats to that and what that means for us here. But right now in healthcare, we're in decent shape. Now, you've probably heard from other presenters about access to providers with, cultural competency and expertise. And, obviously that's much less a matter of law and policy and more a matter of, numbers of providers and ability to access those providers. So I won't speak to that, but healthcare is an area where we're in decent shape. Gender markers on documents and access to documentation change in general. We are, again, a little bit of a mixed bag. At the very end of 2017, so just a few years ago, Montana updated its rules around changing gender markers on birth certificates. This was done through a non-legislative process, what's called a rules change process, through the Department of Health and Human Services, an agency, state agency. And you can now change your gender on your birth certificate through a relatively straightforward process wherein you submit an affidavit and some paperwork to the department and can change your gender marker on your birth certificate. You do not need a court order. You do not need a doctor's note or a letter. You do not need to show any evidence of medical transition or have undergone any medical transition. So that's really, that brings us much closer to the gold standard in terms of dealing with gender markers on documents. On the other hand, one thing that we don't have is what's commonly referred to as an X marker, or a gender marker that is neither male nor female. So for non-binary individuals, there isn't an option available right now for gender markers on documentation. In terms of other documents, so name changes, we do still have a fairly common but somewhat cumbersome process to do a legal name change. You do have to go through the court system. However, you do not have to have any particular set. You don't have to meet any particular set of requirements to show why you should be allowed to change your name. So, quick question about birth certificates from other countries. I do not believe that this applies to birth certificates from other countries. I actually don't know the answer to that. I imagine it might be country to country specific. So I'm sorry that I can't easily answer that. But, this is a process for birth certificates issued by the state of Montana. So I think that is all on documentation. Again, we've made some real advances in the last few years, and we still have a little way to go there as well. In terms of family recognition, so family recognition is an area of law that basically has to do with how the concept of family is defined by law. And, this is a really interesting area of law because family definitions and family recognition shows up all over the place in law. So this could be in anything from foster care or adoption to visitation in criminal justice institutions to tax policy and sort of insurance and social security benefits and other things. And we have just begun as a state to start digging into family recognition. I will say that the sort of gold standard around family recognition policy is to define family as family by blood or affinity, which allows for family members to include chosen family, to include non-married partners of any gender and any gender pairing, I suppose you would say. And we do not have any of that gold standard language in our current law around family recognition. We are starting to see some advances toward that. We do have some same-sex recognition in, obviously marriage and adoption and a handful of other sort of family-specific law. And outside of that, some of these other areas of law that I talked about, this is still one of these gray areas. So again, a mixed bag. And then non-discrimination protections. Let's see, I have a map here. So when we say non-discrimination, we mean the protection from discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. And those are the three big areas of life where many other protected classes or identities of people are protected from discrimination. So you can't be fired because you practice a certain religion. You can't be denied housing because of your race or ethnicity. And you can't be denied service or kicked out of a public establishment or accommodation, again, because of, for instance, your religion. Sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are not covered in our Montana non-discrimination law. That's called the Montana Human Rights Act. We have 5 municipalities that have passed local non-discrimination ordinances, or NDOs, and those are Missoula, Helena, Bozeman, Whitefish, and then Butte-Silver Bow County. And the 4 municipalities provide these protections within the city limits, and Butte-Silver Bow County provides them in the entire county. The rest of the state, as you can see, does not provide these non-discrimination protections. So this is an area where we have a lot of work to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about some potential work on non-discrimination ordinances, both locally and at the state level. But I'll just say protection from discrimination is such an important piece of law and policy for LGBT folks, because we know that LGBT folks, and in particular trans and non-binary individuals, experience poverty, homelessness, and unemployment at much greater rates than their cisgender peers, and a lack of protection from discrimination in in hiring and employment and in housing is one reason. It's not the only reason, but it's a huge reason. And so, as a sort of core access to economic stability and the ability to live with safety and dignity, non-discrimination protections are a really important tool in the toolbox. So, that's sort of a quick snapshot of where we're at. I'll just note a couple other things. Montana does not have hate crime laws that are specific to LGBT folks. We again, there are a lot of other areas of law where there's just not much there, and it hasn't been defined. On the other hand, we also don't have a lot of the sort of stringent anti-LGBT laws that we've seen in other states either. And that sort of brings me to challenges and attacks.
Howell,
Again, I'm going to release.
One question just came up. Somebody just said, I missed the criteria required for changing your gender markers. Can I get those again?
Yes, good question. So in order to change your gender marker on your birth certificate, that is a process that takes place at the Department of Public Health and Human Services. It's called the Office of Vital Records, I believe is the title of that office. And there is a form, you can find that on the website. In fact, if you Google, birth certificate gender change Montana, it'll come right up. So you fill out a form and you have to submit an affidavit. So an affidavit is basically you type up a statement that sort of affirms that you are a transgender individual. Your gender identity does not match the marker on your birth certificate. You have that affidavit signed and notarized, and you submit those two things to the Office of Vital Records. You do not need a letter from a doctor. You do not need a court order. You do not need to prove a length of time that you have lived your gender identity, or you do not have to have undergone any medical transition at all. I hope that answers the question. Let me know if you need any more details there.
There seems to be a follow-up here, and that person just said, perfect, thanks. Can the information you gave about changing birth certificates also apply to residents of Montana with birth certificates from other countries? I think you covered this, but
I did. Yeah, and I'll just say I don't know the answer to that. This really, this is about birth certificates issued by the state of Montana, and I just don't know the answer to that. My apologies. All right. So, let me see. Okay, so past and potential challenges and attacks. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the anti-LGBTQ legislation that we've seen and that we think might come up in our next legislative session. Obviously, one way that law and policy gets shaped is sort of proactive, affirming legislation, or rule changes or local ordinances are passed. But anti-LGBT legislation is another way that law and policy gets shaped. And, we've been fairly lucky in Montana. I'll just say for the last 15 years, we've had a Democratic governor willing to, not the same Democratic governor all 15 years, but a Democratic governor willing to veto some anti-LGBTQ bills that have passed And we've had, some great organizers and lobbyists and advocates willing to fight in the state house to make sure that some of these bills don't advance. That being said, the list here on your screen, this is what we think are some of the sort of most likely and most challenging potential attacks. The first one is what's called religious exemptions. These are commonly known as Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, or RFRA in lingo. And basically what these do is they say they exempt folks from following non-discrimination protections based on their religious beliefs. So this could be everything from a doctor saying that their religious belief prohibits them from providing health care to a transgender individual. It could be, the famous example is a baker saying their religion prohibits them from baking a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. That's in the sort of public accommodation sphere. There's lots and lots of examples, but basically it allows folks to claim a religious exemption from protection for discrimination. We have seen Religious Freedom Restoration Act bills in the Montana State Legislature a couple times before. In 2017, it was a really big fight to actually keep a RFRA off the ballot. It was being proposed as a ballot initiative. And again, passing a religious exemption law in Montana would set us even further back from being able to provide those non-discrimination protections. And it would undo some of the good protections that we do have. I should note, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this earlier, but in terms of non-discrimination, we went through the localities. One other big area that is covered by non-discrimination ordinances are state employees and state contractors and subcontractors. So again, this is really more employment focused, but anyone who is employed by the state is covered under non-discrimination with regard to sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And any business that contracts or subcontracts with the state, so gets any state dollars, also has to comply. So this is actually a lot of folks, like any construction companies that ever fix a highway or build a bridge, a print shop that prints materials for a state agency, the list goes on. And in Montana, the state government and various contractors and subcontractors is actually quite a large employer. So there are a number of people covered under that executive order as well. A religious exemption would undo that. Moving on, bathroom bills. This is also a type of law we've seen in other states, most notably North Carolina. Folks may remember. These are policies that are aimed at trans and non-binary individuals. They state that people have to use the bathroom that corresponds with the sex they were assigned at birth. And again, these are really designed to prevent trans and non-binary folks from being able to really participate in public life, work, go to school, be out and about, again, with safety and dignity. We have seen one bathroom bill in Montana in recent years. It was quashed pretty quickly, but again, we think that it may resurface. in the future. The next two these are policies that have just started to pop up more and more in the last year or so. These are not things that we've had proposed in the state legislature yet, but we're really keeping an eye on them for next year in case they do pop up. Student athlete bans, these again, these are banning trans and non-binary athletes from participating in student athletics. And then limiting access to healthcare for minors, either period or without, explicit parental consent. There are quite a few really ugly bills in other states across the nation right now that basically prohibit doctors from giving anyone under 18 transition-related care whatsoever. And we know that trans and non-binary identities don't come with an age, a start age, and that gender-affirming care can be literally life-saving care in many instances. So, that's an attack that we're going to keep a very close eye out on. And then lastly, preemption of local non-discrimination ordinances. And, basically preemption is a state law that says the state preemptively says local governments, county governments don't have the ability to extend non-discrimination ordinances based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. We first saw one of these bills in 2011. That was the year after Missoula passed the first local non-discrimination ordinance. Successfully beat back that bill, but it does pop up more frequently. And, I think we're going to talk a little bit more in just a minute about some of the other efforts for local NDOs that we've seen in other parts of the state. Every time there's movement at a local level, the state legislature often stops to say, wait, hang on. We want to say you can't do this. So those are some of the things we've seen in the past and that we anticipate. Folks probably know our next state legislative session starts in January of 2021, or at least, we think it will. Given the public health crisis, it may change, I'm not sure. But, for folks who want to stay more involved, keep an eye on these things, that's the next time the legislature will convene. So I want to just take a pause here. I know I can't see any of you, but if folks have any questions or things they want to hear more on, I'll just pause for 10 seconds and see if anyone wants to type anything in.
Great. And I'm monitoring that, Howell, so I'll let you know what comes up.
Great. All right. Oh, schools. So this is a really good question about schools, and I'm actually going to flip forward to start talking about federal law because schools are one area where there was some really great movement under the Obama administration that has been promptly rolled back by the Trump administration. So I'm going to skip ahead and we'll come back to this in a second. So this slide is a little much, and I know that, but you can see the sort of second section down that says education. So in 2016, basically, federal government issued guidance to public schools that say transgender students are entitled to protection. That includes having their chosen name and gender respected, and the right to use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, as well as participation in sports and other extracurricular activities. That guidance was not fully binding. It is not a federal law, but it was, basically it was a clear indication that the federal government would not defend school districts in upholding discrimination against trans or non-binary students. Unfortunately, that guidance was rescinded almost immediately after the administration change in 2017. So basically right now, state law in Montana is silent on school-based policies. There are some school districts that have put together policies, whether it's an anti-bullying policy or, specific guidance around trans students. We think that it's sort of a hodgepodge in Montana about how that's being done. Federal guidance right now is against us. The student athlete ban, in answer to that question, is much more focused on gender identity. Yes, I don't know of any student athlete bans that are particularly focused on, gay and lesbian students, but it really is banning transgender students from participating in gender segregated sports in the sport that matches their gender identity. So, for instance, a trans masculine student playing football in a district where football is restricted to male students, as an example. There's also bans that are more focused on competition. So individual competition in sports like swimming or track and field. Again, banning transgender students from participating in the, I'm not a sports person, so I have all the words wrong, but in the competition that matches their gender identity. So hopefully I answered those two questions. School policy is a particularly complicated one because there are many, many, many layers of government and policy that go into that. Another interesting part of school policy is sex education and whether or not schools offer sex ed that is LGBT inclusive and competent. In Montana, this has been handled at a school district level. So there are a handful of school districts. Helena, most notably, had a very public fight about updating their sex ed curriculum back in, I think, 2011. And part of that was a fight over including LGBT content. Okay, thank you for the questions. I really do appreciate them. Keep them coming if you have them. I'm going to back up one slide here and just talk a little bit about federal challenges. Obviously, no surprise without being too partisan that the federal administration is not friendly to LGBTQ folks. One of the two big challenges that we face right now, one is access to healthcare. I mentioned Section 1557 of the ACA. This is the section that explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and explicitly requires the provision of coverage and care for transition-related medical care. This section is in the process of being overturned. And again, this would be done through an executive order and a rules change process, and not by a law that passes through Congress. Last year, the federal administration took public comments for months on this, and many thousands and thousands of comments were sent in affirming Section 1557 and really pushing for it to remain. But actually, just last week, the administration announced that it was moving forward with a ruling on this, and we expect that to come out any day now, despite the fact that we're in the midst of a public health crisis. Overturning 1557 would almost certainly mean that specifically trans and non-binary individuals would lose access to health insurance that covers transition-related care, and maybe even health insurance, period. And certainly that, would no longer be covered in terms of discrimination from providers. So, that's a real looming threat. There's also 3 Supreme Court cases that have to do with what's called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And basically, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is the title of the Civil Rights Act that protects against sex discrimination. And what's being argued right now in the Supreme Court is whether or not the phrase sex discrimination includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And you could really argue this. No, let me back up. It has been argued both ways. The current read of this title of the Civil Rights Act, or the read that has been used for some years now, says that that sex discrimination really was written to just define sort of cisgender men versus cisgender women. But I think that the case that's being made is that that over time, sorry, I got that a little backwards. That's the case that's being made. Over time, what's happened is that many people have used a judicial reading that says if a woman can put a picture of her husband on her desk and not be fired, but puts a picture of her wife on the desk and gets fired, that's sex discrimination because it's discriminating on the basis of the sex of her spouse. If a transgender woman is fired from work because she is a transgender woman, that is sex discrimination. Unfortunately, the Civil Rights Act, which of course was written in the 60s, is not clear on this. And so there's a fairly complicated legal argument being made in 3 separate cases that's going to try to, at the Supreme Court level, get a ruling on this. We've had lots and lots and lots of rulings at lower level courts that have used Title VII to try to adjudicate or address in the courts issues of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I apologize for the sort of non-articulate nature of that explanation. You may have guessed I'm not a lawyer. But the point is, should the Supreme Court rule that Title VII does not provide protection from discrimination under the sex discrimination clause for issues pertaining to sexual orientation or gender identity, then that that set of jurisprudence that has been used in court cases to fight for, to fight against discrimination would no longer be available, and that is really quite a scary thing. So I'm going to move us on because that was all fairly bad news. Let me talk a little bit about some of the potential opportunities and the good things that are being worked on in the state. The first thing, the Montana Human Rights Act, I mentioned this before. This is the state law that provides non-discrimination protection for folks, based on race, ethnicity, religion, ability, etc., does not currently include sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Every legislative session, a coalition of groups brings a bill to expand the Human Rights Act to add those protections. We have done that, I believe, for the last 20 years. And we will continue to do that. Unfortunately, like I said, the state legislature is not friendly to this bill at all, but I will say that we have, I think, moved the needle on how the Montana Human Rights Act is talked about, and we have seen some legislator education. And I think that this is, I can't promise you that we have a path forward next year, or even the legislative session after that, but I can promise you that, this will continue to be something that is brought every single session until it's passed. I do think that there are some state level laws and policies like banning conversion therapy, as an example, that are very much in the works. And these are, again, things that can be done not through the legislature, but through whether it's executive order by the governor or state agencies, making administrative rules changes. These are things that we do have some momentum on and will continue to push on. I did list a couple things here that are a little bit outside the scope of what we have been talking about. Both criminal justice reform and economic justice. I list these because, again, we know that LGBTQ folks are disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system and disproportionately impacted by poverty and economic injustice. And so reforms that improve people's ability to access safety net services, be paid a living wage and access workers' rights, and or that improve our criminal justice system. We do think that, one, those efforts should specifically name or frame LGBTQ folks within them, and that they have a disproportionate positive impact on queer and trans folks when they pass. So, bail reform is a great example. The vast majority of people who remain locked up on bail are people who are too poor to afford to bail themselves out. And jail, is not a safe place, particularly for trans and non-binary individuals, but really for any LGBTQ folks. So reforming our bail system so that people who are arrested for, any sort of minor offense actually don't go to jail before their trial would have a huge impact on LGBTQ folks. And similarly, economic justice policies that provide safety net services to more folks, again, would benefit our community. And then further local non-discrimination ordinances. So I imagine that lots of folks have followed the stories out of Billings about the the sort of challenging efforts there to move a non-discrimination ordinance. And I would say that, we really, we think that it's important to be sort of targeted and strategic in bringing these ordinances because, they're not easy to pass. And when they fail, it can be really hard on community members and specifically LGBTQ community members. But we do think that there continues to be an incredible awareness of an appetite for expanding NDOs at the local level. So, whether or not Billings will be able to move their NDO in the next year, I can't say, but I do think that this continues to be a way that folks in the state see that we can expand the number of areas and the number of people who are covered under non-discrimination ordinances, and hopefully continue to build that momentum toward a state level win. So I believe, yep, that is, I'm going to back up. That's all the content that I wanted to cover, and I know that was a lot of various policy pieces there. So, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm really happy to take questions or go into more depth if folks do have other things they want to discuss.
Great, and I'll monitor those as well, Howell. Howell, what about getting in touch with you or the organization that you're associated with if our attendees wanted to follow up?
Yeah, great. So I'm happy to follow up with folks. I think that probably the best thing to do, I'm going to go ahead and put our organization's website in the chat box. And I think that, my email is on that website along with other resources and information. So, follow that link. You can find my email and shoot me an email there if you want. Again, happy to follow up with folks. There's also, like I said, some other resources there and links to other organizations that do good work in the state as well that folks might want to follow up with.
Great, and I see you've posted that. We do have a few minutes for questions, so please type those in if you have any in the chat box or in the Q&A. So, Howell, maybe I can just ask a question.
Sure.
What's the future look like for you? What are the next few months or the summer or beyond with the organization? Any planned? What sort of either events or activities or projects do you have going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Normally, our organization on an election year like this, we're really focused on, voter engagement. So getting folks to register to vote, getting folks sort of educated on the issues that they care most about and how those issues might be impacted by the election, and really getting folks turned out to vote, as well as getting ready for the legislative session. I mentioned legislative session starts in January of 2021, but the prep work for policy development and a lot of community organizing really starts in the fall. I will say that it's hard to know exactly what the summer is going to look like. We do hold a lot of community events under normal circumstances, and I'm not sure when or how we'll be able to resume those. But we do a lot of sort of political education events and community building events under normal circumstances. I would say, I mean, this is completely off topic, and again, it's hard to know who all the participants are, but I will say, you know, for LGBTQ law and policy, elections matter an incredible amount. You know, Montana is a state where some elections are decided by honestly a few hundred votes. So I would just encourage everyone to make sure that you're registered to vote. If you've moved recently, to update that voter registration at your current address. You can now do this entirely by mail. And in fact, we will have a link on our website in just a day or two where, you know, we will send you in the mail a voter registration form and a stamped envelope so you can fill it out and mail it to your county elections office. But, you know, the candidates that are being elected this November, they're going to have a lot of say on what law and policy looks like for LGBT folks in Montana in the coming years. So, you know, I think, again, it's up to all of us to engage in the next few elections.
Well, thanks for that. Again, Howell has posted a URL for the organization, and if there are no further questions, we've just about got just a couple of minutes before the top of the hour, so maybe this is a good time to call it. Howell, any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
No, just thanks so much. And, you know, I'm really impressed with everyone participating remotely. And again, hope you all have a great rest of the summit.
Great. Thanks so much again, Howell. Appreciate all the great information. Keep up the good work. And I'll encourage everyone to stay on. Please don't log off. We'll just take a quick break in between. I might show a short video before our next presenter comes on, so stay tuned for that. Howell, again, thanks for all the time and energy, and for all of you, thanks for staying with us. We've got one more session to conclude the summit today. Stay with us, and we'll be right back.
Thank you.